I have received so many requests to continue this story. So, part 4 of William Marshal, the longest serving knight in English history. So where I left off, he was accused of bedding the young King Henry's wife Marguerite, and he says he will clear his name by right of combat, is refused and banished from court. However, after a little while, Henry is having a dispute with his brother Richard, so he needs Marshal back. Marshal comes back, but disaster, Henry contracts dysentery, and dysentery's a nasty way to go. Henry calls Marshal to his bedside, the two, they make up. And Henry asks Marshal to fulfill on his behalf the vow that he had made a few months before to take up the cross of a crusader. Marshal agrees, and a few months later, despite the begging of Henry II to stay, Marshal sets off for Jerusalem. However, this is before the events of the Third Crusade, so this is not the William Marshal Holy Land DLC. He was, however, in the Holy Land for about 2 years, where he grew close to both the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. And after his time in the Holy Land, Marshal heads back to England, where Henry II not only gives him a place at court, but also his first grant of land. Marshal had been a knight for 20 years and had no land. And yeah, it was a small estate around Lancashire, but it was his. Marshal was steadily climbing the ranks of the court. However, in 1188, that court was about to undergo a dramatic shift because Richard the Lionheart, heir to the throne, was in rebellion against his father. Again. However, this time was different because this time, Richard was backed by the King of France, Philip II, who definitely deserves his own video. It's important to remember, Henry II was a warrior king, but as this war raged on, it became increasingly clear that the old king's glory was fading as the young King Richard's was rising. And so the old king's allies and supporters that he'd had all his life started to melt away and join Richard. Not Marshal though. And Henry promises to reward Marshal with a strong marriage, which I think was Isabel de Clare, which would have given Marshal lands in Wales, and England, and Ireland? Essentially, it would have made him a very powerful lord. But the rebellion all sort of comes to a head at the Battle of Le Mans, where the forces of Richard and Philip attack the old king. It proves too much for Henry and he's forced to flee, which means it's up to Marshal to buy him time to escape. Now picture this, Richard the Lionheart leading a charge of horsemen with his sword drawn, and William Marshal rides out to meet him head on. However, the advantage was Marshal's, but while Richard had his sword in hand, Marshal had a lance. Richard calls to him, "God's legs, Marshal, don't kill me," and Marshal says, "No, I won't kill you, I'll leave that for the devil." Kills his horse from under him, unseating the prince. Richard goes down, however, he knows Marshal had the opportunity to kill him, and he didn't. And it's this noble act that saves Marshal because it makes Richard call off the attack. And so Marshal rides to rejoin his king, however, it has become very clear that Henry II is dying. And so he has to make peace. Come back for part 5.